Virginia Theological Seminary, which is mid-Atlantic in northern Virginia. We're about 5-6 miles from the White House. The D.C. is just across the river, and the Pentagon. Last week, I shared some stories about what the area was like, and also some of our journeys in that place. This week, I thought I would talk about some of our journeys outside of the seminary. And one of them, which is so appropriate for today, is the seminary. So it's really interesting. The seminary in the 60s had several friends who passed. One of them was the heiress to the Coca-Cola fortune. Now, she, in her will, her very good friends, she gave like $5,000 cash to, which back then was this, huge sum of money. And to the people that she felt an obligation to give something, but didn't want to give much, she gave stock options in Coca-Cola. And so Virginia Seminary got a portion of Coca-Cola stock back, I want to say in the 50s. And so the seminary is doing very well financially, is the long and short of it. We sell Coca-Cola products in the cafeteria. And part of what they've done with the endowment is to make seminary very affordable to just about anyone who comes, unless you're independently wealthy. We were not. And so seminary was almost cost-free to us. They paid for our tuition and our housing, also gave us a stipend to live on. Very generous. Another part of the generosity, yeah, Jude. Yes. So Jude joined the Cub Scouts last January? February? No, it was December. November, December. Anyway, one of the very first thing, so this is a great Washington, D.C. story. One of the very first thing that his Cub Scout group did after he joined, his Cub Scout leader works for the International Financial Crimes in the Treasury Building, which shares the property with the White House. And the assistant Cub Scout leader is a Secret Service officer in the White House. And so one of the very first things that Jude did with his group was they got to tour the White House. And I didn't get a picture of it, but Jude got to meet the Chief of Staff, John Kelly, while he was there. And there's a picture of him with the very bizarre White House decorations. Jude, do you want to say anything about your trip to the White House? The rooms weren't that big? Okay, yeah. Anyway, thank you, Jude. This is actually going to provide a nice arc to the morning, because we're going to end with a trip I took to the U.S. Capitol during the tax bill debate. So beginning with Jude at the White House and ending in somewhat different circumstances with me at the Capitol. One of the really nice parts about the seminary is that they fund trips for seminary students to go to the Holy Land to study in January. And so the seminary sent me and 12 of my classmates to Israel, to Palestine, for a period of study. This is me at the Temple Haram al-Sharif, which is known as the Dome of the Rock. We had 3 different guides. One man had a PhD in biblical archaeology. So he literally knew like every stone in Palestine and when it got there and when it was destroyed and when they tried to fix it. And also a PhD in Hebrew. And then also our tour guide was a guy named Bashara. And he had worked for the U.S. State Department for several years, running all of the logistics for state visits. So when John Kerry had come to Palestine as Secretary of State, our guide, who was an Anglican, had been an Anglican all of his life, was the logistical operator for all of that trip. So one guy knew all the stones, and Bashara knew every person we met in Israel. The street vendor, the secretary of tourism, and so we got special access to a lot of these sites, which is kind of rare. So we spent 2.5 weeks there, and at this college, which is called St. George's College, which is the Anglican college in Jerusalem. It's about a 10-minute walk from, if you're familiar with Jerusalem at all, I think I've got a picture. A 10-minute walk, that's a picture of Israel, a 10-minute walk from the Damascus Gate, which is the kind of beginning of the Old City. So it's in West Jerusalem. We traveled everywhere, as far south as Hebron, and over to Masada, which is on the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea, if you see the words Jordan, the Dead Sea is right there to the left of that. And then all the way up north to Mount Hermon, which is where there's 4 natural springs that flow into and is the source of the Jordan River. So we went all the way up to there near the Golan Heights. We are just about 50 kilometers from Damascus, Syria. So we were actually in Israeli-occupied Syria for a period of time. And then as far east is Haifa, which is right up there at the top. In Akko, we flew into Tel Aviv. But most of the time we spent in Jerusalem. And I thought since we have all this time on Palm Sunday, I would briefly explain the difficulty of the Middle East. Are you guys interested in hearing this? Okay, great. Well, it can be summarized. One of the first leaders of, does anyone teach on the Middle East at the University of Arkansas? I'm going to say what I have to say anyway, but I just need to look for a reaction. Okay, good. Speak now, forever hold your peace. David Ben-Gurion, who was one of the first leader of Israel, military leader, this is something he stated early on in the process, that the Israeli state has 3 goals. One, this is a paper I wrote before we went to Israel, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in 355 words, right? One is they wanted to create a Jewish state. 2, they wanted that state to be democratic. And 3, they wanted a state that would be located in the historical land of the Jewish people, which is basically everything from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. And Ben-Gurion knew that those 3 things were incompatible. It's not possible to have all 3. And it's a very straightforward reason why, and that is, so just that first sentence, if Israel formed the state to include the Gaza Strip, which is on the Mediterranean, and the West Bank, and preserved itself as a truly democratic nation, then the number of Palestinians would surpass the total number of Jews. So in the 67 war, Israel ethnically cleansed almost the entire northern part of Israel and lots of the southern part of Palestine. They put people on trains and shipped them out. But even with the huge amount of ethnic cleansing that Israel did during the 7-day war, they didn't get everyone, or not nearly enough. And so they couldn't have Israel be the entire land that they wanted and allow all those people to be a part of the nation. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a Jewish state. That is the inherent difficulty. That is why problems go round and round. So the compromise was to create the Gaza Strip and West Bank and for the Palestinians to have semi-autonomous control of those areas. That allowed the Israel proper to be democratic and to be Jewish. But what it didn't really allow is for Israel to occupy the historical lands of the Bible, which is almost all in the West Bank. West Bank is where the meat of the Old Testament happens. So when you hear about settlements being built, they are almost always being built in the West Bank. And it's a policy of slowly taking over that area without having any legal recourse to do so, also without the state fully recognizing that that's what it's doing. So this is the kind of inherent tension of Israel and Palestine. I'll bring up why I'm bringing this up in just a minute. Well, I guess I should just say mostly now, I thought when we went that the trip to Israel would be a trip in which we would mostly get to pray in these holiest of holy sites. That it'd be a time of meditation, a time of prayer, a time of connecting to these stories that we'd heard all of our lives. And I was shocked at, I knew about the tension, of course, for a long time, and was really sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. I was shocked at the current level of brutality that was exhibited from a day-to-day basis. Also, it's hard, one of the things that I came across is that it's hard to see how we get out of this mess without a lot more bloodshed. Again, these three things that the Israeli government wants, no one's really willing to bend on those three principles, and yet it seems like it's on a collision course for violence. One of the nice things about going with St. George's is that they took us to places that most Christian groups don't go. We went to the West Bank a lot, and specifically went down to Hebron, which is one of the most contested areas currently. It was under strong military occupation, even though it's in the West Bank. And that's where, for instance, Abraham and Sarah's tomb is located. And it was a really eye-opening trip. I've got some pictures here, not on the Word document, but on the PowerPoint. So this is a picture of me, bottom left, in the Judean wilderness overlooking the Dead Sea, which you can see in the background. The wilderness really is the wilderness. There was like nothing there but rocks. This is us at Masada. That's again the Dead Sea. This is where Herod built his last stand of resistance. Masada was he basically built a fortress on top of a temple. He didn't quite get there before the Romans got him. But Masada lives on in various folklore. These are all VTS students, mostly, at the tomb of Abraham and Sarah in Hebron, which is a mosque. I'm not going to go into that story. This is me walking in the Mediterranean near Akko, which an old water aqueduct that fed into Akko. This is the Damascus Gate to the Old City in Jerusalem. So I would enter this gate every time I went into the Old City. So one of the things that I was really interested in is a church in Jerusalem called the Holy Sepulchre. And the Holy Sepulchre is one of the oldest churches in Jerusalem. There's very strong archaeological evidence to suggest that the Holy Sepulchre is built on the tomb of Jesus. And the evidence, which was relayed to me by people who understand these things, I can just relate to you what they relate to me. And that is, when Constantine converted in 300-ish, his wife was very devout, and she gave a ton of money to Christians to go back to the Holy Land to build churches on all the most important sites. And so if you can find a 3rd century mosaic, oftentimes, which is really all that's got left, these tiles in the ground, if you can find a 3rd century mosaic, there's a very strong chance that that place is of strong historical importance. And they did find a 3rd century mosaic where the church had believed for over 1,000 years that Jesus had died. The church also is built over what again, there's strong evidence to believe is Golgotha, where Jesus was crucified. So going to the Holy Land was a profoundly formative experience. Just one way it has changed me is, so if we're looking at the Damascus Gate, to our left would be the Mount of Olives and the Valley of Hedron, which is a small dip, a hill, really. That's where Jesus entered from. I think I actually have a picture of Jerusalem. Jesus entered Jerusalem for Holy Week on the Mount of Olives. So Chapel of Ascension is that's the kind of the crest of the hill, which descends into the Mount of Olives and the Valley of Kidron. And then if you see the Dome of the Rock, that's where the Second Temple was. So going to Palestine, Jerusalem, what you learn is that the way that Jesus entered the city of Jerusalem spoke volumes as to the type of Messiah he was to be. When emperors and conquerors and military messiahs enter, they always enter from the west. So if you see right in the middle, that's the Dome of the Rock, that's where the Second Temple is. And the walls of the city always expanded towards the west. After a conqueror would come through, they would always build another set of walls, and so there's a series of walls. So even though the Holy Sepulchre is inside some of the walls of the city, and so we read today that they buried Jesus outside the walls of the city. Well, he got buried outside the really old walls of the city, but inside the newer walls, which weren't there when he was killed. Anyway, so if you look at the city, emperors always come from the west. That's where the Mediterranean is. It's nice and flat. It's easy to get an army through the west of Jerusalem. No military conquest has ever come from the east. That's where the Judean wilderness is. That's where the valleys are. You can't get armies easily through the east. So when Jesus enters from the east, no one would have thought he was coming as a military conqueror, which is what so many people thought the Messiah would do, conquer the Romans through military might. There was a theological statement in the geographic entry of Jesus's of Holy Week of today. So there's like one nugget. Also, when Jesus is standing on the top of Mount Olives for Palm Sunday, being there, you realize that the Judean wilderness, which would have been the escape, that's where people go to hide, that is a 5-minute walk from the top of the Mount of Olives. As Jesus descends to Holy Week, to his violent, brutal death, in Gethsemane, you can see Gethsemane right to the right of the Dome of Rock. As he was praying there with the disciples, as we read today, it was really impressed upon me that escape was just a brisk 10-minute walk in the other direction. And yet he stayed. Okay, so I wanted to get to the Holy Sepulchre. Big time. And because when you're there during the day, lots of tourists, the Holy Sepulchre is owned by 3 different religious groups: the Holy Catholic Church, the Greek Orthodox, and the Syrian Orthodox, I believe, is a third. But 8 different groups have rights to use. 8 different groups have chapels. The Anglicans don't. We didn't get there till like 1850, way before the cheese wheel got divided up. And so when you go into Jesus' tomb, which I've got a picture of, it's very small. There's like a kiosk right in the middle of the Holy Sepulchre. They just finished this. There's a long story there that I'm not going to be tempted to tell. They just finished construction after an earthquake in 1950 almost knocked it over, but no one could decide how to fix it. It literally took 100 years of debate to figure out how to do that. But they just finished. This is what it looks like right now. And you see that archway at kind of bottom in the middle of the screen. You walk in, and there's an outer antechamber, and then there's the tomb, which is about the size of that table, one table, and then another table size area for to kneel next to. And going into the tomb of Christ is you only have like a couple of minutes. No, you only have a couple of seconds before the Greek Orthodox, who are in charge of that area, knock on the door to tell you to get out, you know. And so I was trying to figure out how could I get more time in the tomb of Christ. And so a couple of days, they opened the big Crusader doors to the church at 4 in the morning. I got there a couple of times right at 4 in the morning, but the Roman Catholics have a mass right at 4 in the morning, and then the Greek Orthodox, and then the Assyrian, you know, and so there's no chance to get in, and don't even try to think about getting in unless you're Roman Catholic or Greek Orthodox for the mass. So I was like, what to do? Well, the Roman Catholics and the Greek Orthodox just don't see eye to eye on most things. They're pretty combative. It can often feel like who moved my cheese in like the biggest ramified sense. And I think how this happened is the Roman Catholics, they take off at 9 p.m. To go wherever their monastic beds are. But the Greek Orthodox stay all night to do services. All night, every 30 minutes, they've got some service going on. And so the Roman Catholics came up with the system that if you wanted to spend the night in the Holy Sepulchre, if you found the Franciscan sexton, the Roman Catholic Franciscan sexton, he had a list of 12 people that they allowed to spend the night in the Holy Sepulchre. Because they took off and they just let the tourists stay with the Greek Orthodox, who just could not stand Westerners usually to be in there. So I found this Franciscan monk, and I was like, can I get on this list? And he was like, oh yeah, we love you. You know, like, didn't check my Roman Catholic ID card or anything. And so the Crusader doors, there's this big ceremony, closes at 7 p.m., it's a big ceremony because Christians do not own the keys to the Holy Sepulchre. If one Christian group got a hold of the keys, they lock all the other Christian groups out. So there's a Muslim family that is the steward of the Holy Sepulchre, and it's been that way for 500 years. So the Muslim steward comes at 7 o'clock to lock the door, and so I got there right as it was closing. Big ceremony, lock us in, and I go straight for the tomb. But when I get there, there's only room for 3 or 4 people at most, usually just 3 in there. And I was like, no problem. I'll take second place, which is Golgotha, where Jesus was crucified. That was really great. So went there to pray for a couple of hours, just meditate, and it was really wonderful and beautiful. Went back, and the construction crew had come into the building to fix the tomb of Christ, and they were working on it. And I just thought, I've lost it. They're going to be here all night. I'm not going to get in. So I just sit down for about an hour, and one of the Greek Orthodox acolytes comes in, goes straight through all the construction business, kneels down to pray about 30 minutes, and then leaves. And I was like, better to ask for forgiveness than permission. And so I go in, and there's a A-frame ladder where most people would kneel like this over the. So here's the place where Jesus was laid up to the roof, and I crawl in underneath the A-frame ladder to kneel. And after a few minutes, I hear this loud noise. Someone's like moving something really heavy above head, and I look up, and the ceiling tile has been removed, and I can see people working and moving really heavy objects. And I thought, I'm going to die. But if I die, I will have died in the tomb of Christ. And so my headstone would read, "Here lies Joshua Daniel. He died in the tomb of Christ." And I thought, I can live with this. This is a good way to go. And so I got to stay in there for several hours, just unbelievable. Words can't describe. There was 4 other people that were with me that night, a Polish man who spoke French, 2 Italian men who spoke German, and me who spoke English. So we shared Oreo wafers all night, and that was the extent of our communication. Really nice men. And towards about 3 in the morning, the Catholics came to do their Eucharist service and invited me to go in with them back into the tomb and for the first Eucharist of the day. And went in with them, and we laid prostrate almost the entire Eucharistic Mass. And yeah. I'm going to move on. Okay, Jim Walls. Let's get to the. So here's the arc. Jude started at the White House, a summer internship in Maryland. This is summer internship last summer at St. Mary's Parish in St. Mary's City, which is where the first capital of Maryland was. They used, when the Protestants rebelled in 1680, they used the bricks from the old Capitol building to build this church. This one right here. It's also 2 miles from Great Falls, Maryland, which is where the shooting was last week that injured two students. This is their country chapel, just one of the most beautiful churches I've ever been to. I also published a book, no time for that, about a man named Martin Percy. The dean of the seminary asked me the first week I got there to help him with this project, Jude's soccer team. So I was a seminarian at Church of the Epiphany, which is really close to the White House and has a huge homeless congregation or members. And every year we did a march for homelessness to the White House. We walked around it as a witness for social justice. Social justice is a huge part of that church. I preached on the fundamental importance of our call as Christians to be a people for the poor. When the tax reform debate was going middle of November, and it looked like, unlike all the other major legislation that the Trump administration had tried to pass, had failed, it looked like this was going to pass. And the night before, on Wednesday night, I had watched people getting yanked out of the Senate committee meeting on the tax debate, and I had just a moment of conviction that I could not go back to my church and preach again on social justice if I did nothing. I've just felt a very strong conviction that I had to do something. We lived 6 miles from the Capitol building, so emailed my professors that night. I said, "You'll have to excuse me. I'm going to be at the Capitol protesting." Now, that's the extent of my plan. Go and protest. I tried to find some groups that were protesting online that night. I couldn't find anyone. So I got to the Capitol building, and I went and found all 4 of my senators, 2 from Arkansas, 2 from Virginia, and I went to Tom Cotton's office first and asked if I could talk to someone who was working on the policy aspect of the tax bill. And this is how Washington works. They said, "Sure, have a seat." So I sat down, and one of the main men who wrote the tax policy came in to talk to me about my concerns. And I'll save that conversation for another time. And then I went, that was in one Senate building, and then I had to go to the Hart Senate building to find the other senators. Well, as I went into through the security line, I heard a big commotion in this huge atrium. And someone asked the security guard, what's going on in there? And he said, oh, those people, don't go near those people. They're about to get arrested. And I thought, I found my people. And I walked up, and it was a Christian group. And at the center was this man, a guy named Jim Wallis, who I had read as an undergraduate many years ago. He wrote a book called God's Politics, which very significantly helped reshape my sense of what Christianity is about. God's Politics is about how neither the right nor the left have a claim to the gospel, and what the gospel is about is advocacy for the marginalized and for the poor. So when I saw Jim Wallis, I knew that I had found the right people. And they were going around reading verses advocating for the poor straight from the Bible. Now, what I didn't know at the time is that Jim Wallis is also the founder and editor of Sojourners Magazine in D.C. It's a huge group of advocacy for social justice issues. And what I didn't know is that Sojourners, of course, had been lobbying against the bill the entire time it had been proposed. And then last week they had decided that all of their efforts had failed, the bill was likely to pass, and as an act of civil disobedience, they were going to go to the Hart Building, the U.S. Capitol, and read Bible verses in violation of the Senate building rules, which is that you can't do protests on the Senate grounds, knowing that that would lead to their arrest. Their lawyers had called the Capitol Police to let them know what was going on. And so in some ways, it's a very kind of coordinated dance between the Capitol Police and this group of protesters. When I walked in, they were in the middle of reading the Bible verses, and the police were yelling out that this is your final warning to dismiss before you'll be arrested. And as they were getting arrested, they couldn't read the Bible verses anymore, but part of my own spiritual devotion, I memorized quite a bit of the Book of Common Prayer, and I went up to ask one of the leaders if I could recite the Song of Mary, the Magnificat, which is a very prophetic piece of literature in our New Testament, very clearly aligned with the poor. And as I took a step forward, a policeman rushed in front of me and he said, "Sir, if you take another step, you will be arrested." And I said, "I came to be with these people. I came to speak out for this cause, and so I'm willing to do that." And he said, "Okay, no problem." And at that moment, I didn't exactly know what I was getting myself into. I mean, I knew Jim Wallis, so they weren't going to disappear Jim Wallis in the middle of the night, So I felt somewhat safe, but I didn't know if arrest meant getting out the next day or the next week or appearing in court or how much money it would be. But anyhow, so I joined their group and began reciting the Magnificat, and halfway through they came to arrest me. Now, I've said the Magnificat in 1,000 different places and 1,000 different times, and usually can get through it pretty well. Getting arrested was not one of the things I had trained for, and there's a long video you can find on Sojourner's website on Facebook of the whole thing, and I just totally wreck the Magnificat halfway through, but I collect myself and get back and finish. And so they take us out to the police vans, and Jim Wallis and I end up sharing a cell for the rest of the day in a D.C. jail. And just a really powerful moment. We talk a lot about, he went to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Chicago right after the Vietnam War, and about the type of protests that were going on there at seminary, and also some of the experiences that I had had at Virginia. And it wasn't a week in jail, it was just 2 hours. Apparently, getting arrested in D.C. is less money than getting a parking ticket in D.C. It's a $50 cash payment, which I didn't have. A Franciscan monk bailed me out. And so anyway, I got to finish quick now, but afterwards we went back to Sojourners to debrief. there were supposed to be 12 people who got arrested. One person had to drop out, so I became the 12th person. New numbers to us Christians means something. It meant a lot to them that the 12th person just showed up. It was a really incredible moment. The craziest thing, and we'll end here, is so after I get out of Sojourners, I think, it's time to call Jenna, you know? And so I called Jenna, and my plan was like, this is the type of information that's best discussed in person. You know, like you can handle things a little bit better that way. So I called Jenna, and it's like, hey, babe, how's it going? And she's like, no, don't you even try that with me. And I was like, what are you talking about? And she was like, Joshua, someone forwarded the Facebook Live video of you getting arrested. I watched you get arrested live on Facebook. And she was like, don't you ever put me in the position of randomly finding a video account of you getting arrested in the U.S. Capitol. Which she graciously forwarded on to my mother, and she also got to share in that moment. The last thing I'll say about this, lots to unpack, but one of the conversations that was really difficult was explaining to our 7-year-old, Jude, why I had done this. And for Jude, as for all 7-year-olds, maybe especially for 7-year-old boys, there are good guys and there are bad guys. And the bad guys go to jail. And literally over that next week, Jude would probably ask me 2 or 3 times. He would say, Dad, I understand why you had to go to protest. Why did you have to get arrested? You know? And that was such a wonderful conversation, and Jude was very vulnerable to ask. And I told him that, Jude, sometimes the laws of our country are not right. And when we take away money from the poorest in society to give it to the rich, as Christians, we must say no. Now, that was my conviction. When I'm at Epiphany preaching, it's not in those direct terms, but that is the underlying theme of so much of what that church is about and of my own sense of vocation. I feel really bad that I've talked through this whole time without a chance for questions or reflection. Maybe just one question before I'm already dressed for church, before we have to scoot off. Thank you so much for your patience and attention and sharing these stories with me. All right. Yes, Jude. Can what? Oh, my goodness, I don't think so. We'll have to do some wrestling later. All right. Thanks, y'all.